Hello, everybody. My name is Bridget Tyre, and welcome to the Resilient Leadership Podcast, where everything we talk about is aimed at helping you to lead with a greater sense of calm, clarity, and conviction, even in anxious times. And I'm delighted, as always, to be joined by my colleague and co-host, Irvin Nugent. Irvin, it's wonderful to see you and be with you. How the heck are you?
I'm doing great, Bridget. Thank you for asking. Yeah, I love the fall, and I'm anticipating some changes of leaves, it's my favorite time to go out for some walk, and there's a little nip in the air. So I'm loving it. It's really wonderful.
Yeah, that nip in the air, which has just arrived, right? Especially the early mornings and then the evenings, It signals a change. It's just really cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have a very interesting topic for today, I think. We're calling this episode The Upside of Anxiety.
Love it.
And to our listeners who have been following along, they may be, what? Because we have talked a lot. In fact, even in the last episode, we reminded our listeners that anxiety, while it keeps us safe and ensures survival, it can have some pretty significant consequences, right, for our lives and for our workplaces.
Yep.
And yet, in this episode, we're going to kind of look at it from a different point of view. There are some incredibly powerful benefits, obviously, because anxiety has hung around all these many years. And so what can we learn about how it benefits us? And what might this provide for us in terms of how we better leverage this powerful instinct in our lives? Okay, so Irvin, I am wanting to ask you right away, can you think of a time when you were pretty anxious and it turned out to be something that was really helpful? Like the anxiety, maybe it wasn't particularly pleasant, but it ended up helping you in some way.
You know, the one that really I can focus on is my response, and specifically my business response to COVID. So when COVID came, of course, massive anxiety and at many different levels. But certainly I'm in the profession of speaking and training, and they tend to be all live events. So all of a sudden, before my very eyes, my business was wiped out for at least 6 months in advance. And of course, that was incredibly full of anxiety. What's next? What do I do? But what was interesting about that time as well is that I think the anxiety helped me to focus. It helped me to really discern what's important now in this moment. What do I need to do to keep my business afloat? And I made a couple of decisions. One decision was I want to write a book. And I've never found time for that. And the second thing is I'm going to turn 2 or 3 of my most popular trainings and get them up running virtually as soon as I possibly can. And let me tell you, I worked with a focus that was second to none, because boy, I can get distracted and I can get little rabbit holes, etc. But I got up every morning at 5 o'clock. I wrote for 3 or 4 hours for the book. And then in the afternoon, I did a little more work around getting the virtual up. So that for me it was not a great, business wise, it was full of anxiety, it was uncomfortable, but boy, did it help me focus. And really, I came out of it with a new book and with some trainings that were all virtual.
Oh, I love that. And I can relate to that because I remember when the pandemic first sort of broke in March of 2020. One of the commitments I made to myself was to use the time to be creative. So I really resonate with that. Yeah, that's lovely. Yeah.
How about you, Bridget? Can you think of a time when you were really, really anxious, but that anxiety helped you to avert a threat and to create something different?
Well, yes. And I could give a similar example to the one you just shared, but I'm going to go back, way, way back to when I had a newborn daughter. She was my second. We brought her home from the hospital. She was a couple of days old. And, newborns are very sleepy. Sometimes you have to jog them and try to wake them up to eat because they're just really tired in those early days. So that was normal to be expected. And she was very sleepy. But I started to get anxious because I looked at her and I thought, she's listless. There's something here that isn't right. And I can feel the chills in my body right now, reliving the anxiety. And I said to my husband, I don't know. I don't think she's well. And he goes, she's fine. She's eating. The hospital said she'd be really sleepy. She's just sleepy. She's going to be fine. But you know what? The anxiety was like this ringing alarm bell that would not shut up. And I had to listen to it. And finally, I picked up the phone and called my pediatrician. And I thought, I bet he's going to say the same thing my husband said, which is, she's fine. You know what he said? Get her to the hospital immediately.
Wow. Oh.
He said, get her to Children's Hospital downtown. I said, oh my gosh. And sure enough, and we did, obviously. And she had a very serious infection and a high fever. And she was in the hospital for 5 days.
Whoa.
Had I not listened to that instinct of deep and relentless anxiety, it could have been really disastrous, and I'm so grateful for that. Yeah. So, it's interesting because both of us spoke about the unpleasant nature of the anxiety itself.
Yep.
But the result was great. And I think anxiety can feel, well, it does. It feels so unpleasant that often we want to just get rid of it. The last thing we want to do is walk around feeling incredibly anxious.
Yeah.
And so we try everything we can to, I think, get rid of it.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, does that ring a bell for you too? And have you ever coached somebody, or maybe just in your own experience, where somebody was feeling so anxious and either they wanted to get rid of it, but they couldn't, and it just kept persisting and lingering and so forth? I don't know what comes to mind.
It's interesting. So I think there was actually a coaching conversation I had last week, and it was with a client whose colleague is in a position where they have to assign different tasks that need to be done. And what was interesting about the conversation was that this person who's assigning the task is a deeply, deeply anxious person, and anxious about the whole process and full of self-doubt. Are they getting it right? And what will happen if the task isn't done? And really, living through that anxiety. And she said, they went for coffee the other day, and the person was just talking about, oh, I hate it. I hate this anxiety I feel. And I go into work and all of a sudden, I open these emails and there's 4 more things to be done, and I assign them and I worry and fret about them all day. Are they going to get done? Are they not? And she said, I know I know it's not my responsibility, but I can't help it. And so it's this constant state of unease and this desire just to offload it, to get rid of it. It really is persistent within them.
Yeah. And isn't it interesting that it's such an uncomfortable state that our resistance to feeling uncomfortable becomes part of the problem.
Yes,
right?
Yes, absolutely.
It complicates it. It snowballs it.
Yes.
It's oh my God, I'm anxious. I don't want to feel anxious. That makes me feel more anxious. And it makes it harder to think our way through the issues, right? Yeah.
Yep.
So this is interesting because, what if the very unpleasant nature of anxiety is part of its magic? That because we so, 1, feel uncomfortable, and 2, can't easily rid ourselves of it, right?
Yeah.
Maybe that's part of its magic. All right. So I think what we got to do is we got to get right into, the benefits of anxiety and the neuroscience. Because, Irvin, I know especially you love to share with our listeners the neuroscience behind this. So there's some interesting connections between brain chemistry and anxiety and the benefits of anxiety. So I'd love to hear about one of those.
Yeah, so it's interesting. We've already said that anxiety has some benefits, and one of the things it helps us avoid danger. We're here today because of anxiety. Blessed anxiety! It has helped us survive. And one of the ways, and it's so beautifully exemplified in your story of your child, is that it propels us to action. That anxiety you felt, even though you were hearing different voices around you, it propelled you to act. And thankfully, that action had thankfully turned out well for your child, and that's so important. This incessant uncomfortableness moves us, and so. It's interesting. I think both of us were talking about a book that we had read, which is called Future Tense by a great author, Tracy Dennis Tawari. And in that book, I think she does a great job of helping us understand that anxiety is not just about avoiding threats, but it's also about reward. And so what we know is that anxiety releases dopamine in the brain, and we've talked about dopamine, which is this feel-good hormone. And how does that happen? Well, this anxiety motivates us, as we've already said. We want to avoid these bad outcomes, and so therefore we're motivated to do good, to have rewarding. Your motivation was to call the doctor and say, hey, I think something's up here. So it propels us into a good action. And when that dopamine is released, this desirable outcome is achieved. We feel relief, and all of a sudden, the anxiety lessens. And so that release of dopamine, it's both contains both of these pleasures. So we have the rewarding outcome, but then also the relief that goes with doing that. And so therefore, what's being taught within us is that doing something good with our anxious feelings is good.
Mm-hmm.
We need to pay attention to them because there may be a message in here, and therefore it's motivating to take effective action.
Mm-hmm. That is really interesting.
Yeah.
Because nobody would assume that anxiety is somehow linked to the triggering of dopamine, which is a feel-good hormone.
Yeah.
And yet it is linked to that because it motivates us to achieve desirable outcomes. And when that outcome is achieved, we feel great and we feel relief.
Yeah.
That's reminding me of an experience I had not that long ago where I was giving a keynote for, I don't know, maybe I think there was going to be like 220 people there. And of course I get a little anxious, a little nervous, because if I didn't, that would be weird. But I've given a lot of these, so I wasn't particularly anxious until kind of like the day before or 2 days before, I started feeling anxious, like unusually anxious. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, this is weird. I've given so many of these. I sort of wanted to just get rid of it, just don't pay attention to it. It wouldn't let go of me. And so finally, I just said, okay, I got to get back into this. So when I went to prepare for it, you know what I found? I found that I had I knew this, I'd inserted some new information that I was going to teach and share that I'd never done before. And I didn't have examples. I was not prepared for that little segment. And that was what I was anxious about. So I spent some more time figuring out, how am I going to say this? What examples am I going to share? And I go and give the presentation, and lo and behold, I nailed it. But if I had not felt uncomfortable enough to look and see what was not yet ready for prime time, I might not have hit a home run. And when I hit the home run, I got to tell you, the rest of the day and into the next day, I thought I was on drugs. I was on dopamine.
I love it. I
felt so fantastic. And so I totally get this now connection with the dopamine and the achievement of an outcome and the relief. Fabulous. Evelyn.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so that's fascinating. So anything else that you want to share, neuroscience?
Yeah, it's interesting as well. So along with the dopamine, there also anxiety stimulates the release of oxytocin, which we have mentioned before. Oxytocin is popularly called the cuddle hormone, the love hormone, the bonding hormone. And oxytocin is this neurotransmitter that makes us yearn for others, that makes us yearn for company. And think how beautiful that is. So we are triggered in anxiety. And then part of the reaction to that is, can I draw close to others? Can I connect with others? And, I started giving you the example of the pandemic. And we had so many beautiful examples of pandemic. Here we had this existential threat. And one of the reactions, even in our inability to be physically close with each other, to create avenues, be it in Zoom, be it in phone calls, be it on balconies we saw of people singing with each other for connection. I have a very dear friend, and they had a rather strained relationship with one of their parents. And yet, what was so beautiful about this, when COVID happened, all of that went out the window. And there was anxiety about their parent who was rather advanced in age, and they lived out of state, so they couldn't really connect with them. And so there's this overall concern about how were they coping. They started to initiate phone calls, which really had been few and far between. And she said to me, I came out of COVID with a much stronger relationship with my parent, thankfully. And that was so beautiful. Yeah, of how. And so that's important. And even if it's superficial, the research shows that connection can relieve anxiety. And and especially when we're going through tough times, the presence of loved ones, the presence of connection helps our nervous system to regulate and to feel the threats we face. I often think of another situation that, some of my earlier work in the U.S., I worked with some people fleeing the Civil War, and I was an immigrant myself from Ireland. And I know that one of the places I used to like to go was an Irish pub, because it was familiar, and I had a connect. So moving to a new country is incredibly stressful.
Yes.
And yet, where do we go? We tend to flock around connections, our own community, people from our country of origin. It helps us to derive comfort, etc. And so that's so common. You see that in immigrant communities, and really that's what it's about. It's about supporting one another and relieving some of that intense anxiety they feel by reconnecting with others from their homeland and others who share similar cultures. And you see that a lot. So here, you have this anxiety, which both drives us to action. It's unpleasant. It propels us to that action. And then one of the ways that happens is by creating connection for loved ones. And I mentioned the author of Future Tense, and she really says it beautifully by saying it contains this beautiful fractal symmetry.
Yes. It's amazing. So anxiety stimulates the release of oxytocin, which is the hormone that makes us yearn for connection. And that connection relieves the anxiety some, but also helps us face into danger more bravely.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Yeah. Wow. And I love the idea of you wanting to hang out at the pubs. Hey, I totally get it. It's just interesting. Yeah.
So, Bridget, given these powerful benefits, so it's kind of like looking at anxiety maybe in a different way. Talk to us a little bit about how can we leverage that? How can we experience it more as a benefit rather than as a burden?
Yeah, well, I think you just said something that to me is a clue to the very first way to leverage this powerful instinct as a benefit, which is to shift our perspective on it. Anxiety has a bad rap.
Yep.
And yes, it has some downsides and it does need to be managed. And yet, if we just also, it's not a but, it's not an either or, it's an and it serves us so very, very well. And just that shift in perspective can help us leverage it. In fact, I found this really interesting. So there's this test called the TSST, the Trier Social Stress Test. It sounds like a god-awful test, and it was given to people who were socially anxious to see how they would become more anxious. And you have to perform complicated math problems
Oh
in
my
front
God.
of a panel of people who tell you you're going too slow and speed it up. It's like counting backwards by 13 from like 2000. Okay? Just listening to it made me anxious.
Yes,
Okay? All right.
likewise.
So Harvard researchers, and I think it was 2013, had this idea like, well, what if we could perform that TSST test to socially anxious folks, a group of socially anxious folks, but tell them ahead about the benefits of anxiety, that it's there to help them focus, like you said in the beginning. It focuses our attention. It floods our body with oxygen and blood so that we can perform at a higher level, right? It galvanizes us to take action. And it's there actually to make us more effective. And guess what? When they shared those benefits with people before the stress test, they had more confidence, they had less anxiety, and their bodily functions were at a much healthier level in terms of heart rate, blood pressure, and so forth. So see, just realizing that the anxiety is not the giant foe that we fear, but embracing it as a necessary part of life and as an ally can go a long way towards leveraging this benefit, right? Yeah.
Yep.
So I thought that was really cool. I don't know. What about you? What do you think is another important way to do that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of riffing off that. I think as well, another way is to perhaps distinguish between helpful and unhelpful anxiety. We've already introduced this as helpful, but unhelpful, how many times do we wake up at night sometimes and we're feeling anxious? And we're racking our brains. What am I anxious about? I don't know. It's kind of floating there. It doesn't make any sense to us. There's no real threat or challenge, and we don't. Therefore, because of that, we don't know what we can do to get rid of it. And that's just really unhelpful. Or sometimes what's unhelpful as well is when we have a false alarm. We're highly attuned to things that are going on around us, and sometimes our alarm system isn't the best, and sometimes it goes off when really there isn't a fire. And there isn't a fire literally or metaphorically going on in our lives. We just have to realize that this is just unhelpful.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing is then perhaps to realize when anxiety is helpful. That when anxiety is pushing us, this uncomfortableness we feel pushes us towards taking specific action to a challenge. What can I do? What action can I take? What might be this encouraging me to do? So instead of saying, I feel this nasty anxiety, is like, oh, that's interesting. Well, what can I do? What's the next step? Where do I need to focus my energy? Where do I need to focus my attention? What's the message in this? Maybe there's a gap between where I'm at and where I need to be. And maybe this is a challenge, a propulsion to move myself into that. And I think that can be really helpful, distinguishing both of those and then really taking action when it's helpful anxiety.
Mm-hmm. That's great because we do know that sometimes the anxiety that we're feeling is off. It's like a faulty alarm system, right?
Yeah.
And yet, at the beginning of this episode, you and I shared examples where the anxiety that we felt was insistent and specific and urging us to take action. And we did. And so I just find that distinction between helpful and unhelpful anxiety really important. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
So, Bridget, we always try and end our episode with something concrete, a practice that people can take with them. So, any ideas about a practice for helping us really see the upside of anxiety?
Yeah, so I'm going to call this practice dissolve and deploy. Now, in a previous episode, we talked about the 4 Ds of anxiety. I think it was distract, displace, dissolve, and deploy. I'm just focusing on 2 of those, dissolve and deploy. And I'm going to build off of what you just said, because the first step of the practice, when we're feeling anxious, is to take a breath or two and discern whether the anxiety is the helpful kind or the unhelpful kind, right? If it's the unhelpful kind, that means it's vague, it's generalized, it's not giving us clues as to what it's about or how to take action, or it might be that there's nothing we can do at that moment, right? Maybe we know what we're anxious about, but there's nothing to be done about it right then. Or perhaps it is the helpful kind, like you just said. So after you know which is which, if you discern that, you know what, this is not helpful right now, then you dissolve it. What does that mean? You let it go. You take a break from it. You put it in a little box for safekeeping. And we know how to do that. The best way to dissolve unhelpful anxiety, the best way to let it go, is to do the things that calm our nervous system and that bring us into the present moment, in touch with our sensations, in touch with our physical surroundings, whether that's taking a walk, whether that's doing breath work, whether that is listening to music. We know what those things are that bring us fully into the present moment. That's the best way to dissolve anxiety that's not helpful. Now, of course, if it's the helpful kind, we want to deploy it. We want to put it to good use. We want to be purposeful with it. Like you were in the pandemic, you took that giant mass of anxiety and you were purposeful with it in terms of creating training courses, right? In terms of writing a book. I mean, that's fantastic. That is what anxiety is really there for. It's meant to be used in a purposeful way to create a new and better future for ourselves and for our loved ones, right? So that's the practice: dissolve and or deploy. And by the way, you might do a little of both. You might dissolve some anxiety that maybe you're going to revisit, but in the moment, there's nothing you can do about it. So you let it go, and then you come back to it when its message rears back up again, and you're in a place where you can listen to it.
Wow. I love that. Dissolve and deploy. I need to learn more of that. I need to, and that's a practice I think I want to embrace in my life. So,
amen.
Yeah. Well, hopefully you've enjoyed this episode, and hopefully we've kind of given you some way of perhaps looking on this word of anxiety a little bit differently, because so often anxiety does get a bad rep. However, anxiety also has some wonderful purposes, and hopefully you've begun to see that, of how it can help us propel ourselves to take action, which ultimately can lead to the release of some wonderful reward dopamine. It can propel us to create community in which we find safety, which in turn can help us then further take action. And I love the whole practice of dissolve and deploy. And perhaps, instead of seeing good old anxiety as the enemy, actually a friend. Befriend it, because it can help us move into new action and can truly help us create some new decisions and solve problems in our lives. So thank you, Bridget. For our listeners, please subscribe to the podcast. If you think that this will be useful for some person in your life, feel free to share it. We love to know what you're thinking. If you have any suggestions for future episodes, please email us at resilientleadershippodcast@gmail.com. Next episode, we are going to look at a discussion around creating rewarding workplaces. So I look forward to that as well. Bridget, thank you so much. Thank you for really helping us shed a new light on anxiety and thinking about it in a different way.
Irvin, thank you for this conversation. I feel like I learned so much. And as you said, I'm going to put the dissolve and deploy practice into practice in my own life. So thank you, listeners, for being with us as always.
Goodbye. Have a great week ahead, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Take care.